Welcome back, everyone, and we're going to continue our discussion on Chapter 5, the cell signaling and the hormonal responses to exercise. In this video, we're going to do a basic introduction to the anatomy of the endocrine system. So before we get into the anatomy of the endocrine, let's do a quick review. So in the previous video, we discussed what endocrinology is. Additionally, we broke it down to subparts of the nervous system and how it ties into with the endocrine system itself. Furthermore, we defined what hormones were and the three different types. Again, we said that those different types were steroid, amino acid, and peptide hormones. And lastly, we discussed the three different types of hormone mechanisms of action. The first being the direct action onto the end tissue, and we typically see this with steroid hormones. The second being the G protein, which uses secondary messengers, and we had two different types, with those being the phospholipase C and cyclic AMP. And then finally, we had the insulin receptor pathway. And so we're going to build upon this knowledge when we start with the anatomy of the endocrine system. So previously we stated that hormones are secreted by endocrine glands. And within the endocrine system, there are 5 major endocrine glands, and these include the following: the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, the adrenals, the pancreas, and testes and ovaries. So, as we show here, the hypothalamus is located on the undersurface of the brain, which I'm circling here in red. And just below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, which I'm circling here in green. The pituitary gland has 2 components. The first we call the anterior pituitary gland, and the second is the posterior pituitary gland. And the name denotes which one's located where. The anterior is on the front side, whereas the posterior is on the back side. Besides their location, the anterior and posterior pituitary glands each produce different hormones and act differently on the way the hormones release and work upon the physiology of the human body. Let's go ahead and break that down. And so the anterior pituitary gland produces 7 different hormones, and these are as follows: the adrenocorticotropic hormone, the follicle-stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, the melanocyte-stimulating hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. And so in the names of all these 7 hormones, you see a couple of different items. You see the names of stimulating, secreting, and stuff like that. And the reason of this is the form of action that the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland works in communicating with other organs. And so the way that most of the anterior pituitary gland hormones work is the anterior pituitary gland releases them into the bloodstream, and then they act on the effector organ to release more hormone to eventually get to the target effect. And so let's work through an example of this, particularly with the thyroid stimulating hormone. A very good example of how the anterior pituitary gland hormone signaling works is by looking at the hormone of TSH, again, which is called the thyroid secreting hormone. And every hormone that is involved with the anterior pituitary gland, it is signaled by the hypothalamus to be released into the bloodstream. And so for the example of TSH, the hypothalamus releases the hormone, thyroid releasing hormone. Or TRH for short. And so what TRH does is it travels down the bloodstream directly to the anterior pituitary gland. And then from there, the anterior pituitary gland releases TSH, or thyroid secreting hormone for short. And this hormone enters the bloodstream and then travels down to the thyroid glands, which we find right here in the front part of our neck. From there, the thyroid gland releases T3 and T4. And these are the hormones that are primarily responsible for metabolism regulation within the body. And furthermore, if T3 and T4 concentrations get too high within the body, then what this does is has a negative feedback loop and causes the hypothalamus to stop secreting TRH, which then blocks the rest of this transmission of the signal pathway. And so the key takeaway with this example with the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland is their primary signal for release comes from the hypothalamus. That sends a particular hormone to the anterior pituitary gland. Then that releases a particular releasing hormone, which works on an effector organ. Then that in turn releases another hormone that then typically works on the target tissue. So most of the hormones that come out of the anterior pituitary gland are part of a multi-step process. Now, within these 7 different hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland, I want to highlight a little bit more about the growth hormone. I bring up the growth hormone because it plays an important role when we're talking about hormonal signaling in exercise. And so when we look at the growth hormone in exercise, one of the primary effectors that causes its release is exercise itself. And other factors are sleep and stress and, of course, low glucose. These stimuli cause the hypothalamus to release the hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. And that activates the anterior pituitary gland to release the growth hormone. Now, the importance of the growth hormone in exercise is multifold. The first is its ability for protein synthesis and growth. And what we mean by this is research shows that growth hormone helps activate or increase protein synthesis of those particular proteins shown to increase muscle mass. The other side of this too is it works on the liver to help with gluconeogenesis. And what gluconeogenesis is the creation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. And finally, it blocks glucose entry in the adipose cell in favor of fat mobilization. And so what I want you to take away from this is the 3 elements that growth hormone affects in response to exercise. Now moving along in our discussion, let's focus on the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland has 2 hormones. And these hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Also, to keep things a little more interesting, you'll also see ADH written or named as vasopressin, or VSP for short. The reason this hormone has a couple of different names is because of its effects on the human physiology. And we will get into the effects of ADH on the human body in the next video. Next, let's change our focus onto the thyroid gland. As we stated earlier when looking at the mechanisms for the anterior pituitary gland, it is stimulated by the hormone of TSH. And TSH, again, is released by the anterior pituitary gland. And the thyroid gland is responsible for the production of the 2 hormones, T3 and T4. And so the official name for T3 is triiodothyronine. So let's just call it T3 for short. And also, the proper name for T4 is thyroxine, or T4. And so both of these hormones influence metabolic rate in the body. Also, they're permissive hormones. And what this means is they permit the full effects of other hormones. Also, thyroid gland produces the hormone calcitonin. And this is involved with the regulation of plasma calcium levels. And so what you need to take away for the thyroid gland is the hormones that it produces. And again, that's T3, T4, and calcitonin. And what you need to know is the effects of T3 and T4 on the body. And so the next gland is the parathyroid gland. And this gland produces the parathyroid hormone. And this hormone is responsible for a couple of different things, which are as follows. The first thing we see with the parathyroid hormone, it is the primary hormone in plasma calcium regulation. Next, we see that it stimulates calcium release from the bones and also calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. And finally, the parathyroid hormone converts vitamin D into a hormone that increases calcium reabsorption from the GI tract. So what we see is the parathyroid hormone is primarily responsible for calcium regulation in the body. And what this does is, primarily here with the second tenet, is it works on bone development. And if you go back and look at the bone remodeling process, the release of calcium from the bones is part of that whole process. And so the parathyroid hormone has a large part in bone remodeling. The next thing I want to briefly touch on is the adrenal medulla. And what we find, the adrenal medulla, or the adrenal glands, they secrete the hormones called catecholamines. And catecholamines are norepinephrine and epinephrine. These two hormones are fast-acting, and they play a large role in the fight or flight response. And why is that? First off, they cause significant increases in heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, glycogenesis, and lipolysis. Essentially, what we're saying with all this is priming the body to get ready to go. Secondly, we find that these two catecholamines are messengers for the somatic nervous system, or SNS for short. And we'll touch base on this in Chapter 8. So if we went deeper into the adrenal glands, we'd get into the portion called the adrenal cortex. And this portion of the adrenals secretes a different set of hormones than what we just discussed with the adrenal medulla. And so the adrenal cortex secretes steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. And then what we find is there are three different classes of steroid hormones. And they are as follows. The first class is what we call mineralocorticoids. And the one that I want to highlight is the hormone of aldosterone. And this hormone regulates sodium and potassium levels in the body. And these are important when we're talking about hydration. And so we'll discuss the exact mechanism of aldosterone in the next video. The next class of steroids is glucocorticoids, and this class of steroids contains the hormone cortisol, which we also know as the stress hormone. And so the effects of cortisol in the human body is it helps to mobilize amino acids in tissues after exercise. And so what this does is this helps with protein synthesis. Secondly, it helps mobilize free fatty acids, or FFAs. And again, this helps with energy production. Also, it stimulates gluconeogenesis, and finally, cortisol also helps block the entry of glucose into the tissue. And if you put all these together, cortisol is helping with recovery. So all these effects that we've just mentioned here, the mobilization of amino acids, fatty acids, stimulation of gluconeogenesis, and the block of entry of glucose into the tissue are all positive effects. But we have heard that cortisol has several negative effects. And so that is the case with cortisol, and it's a case of too much of a good thing. Because when it starts having its negative effects is when we have too high of a concentration of cortisol for too long. And so that's when it becomes negative. And so the final class of steroid hormones that we're going to mention are the sex steroids. And these are androgens and estrogens. And these are primarily responsible for supporting prepubescent growth. And so there's a couple of key takeaway messages I want you to have from this. The first is the adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone, cortisol, and the estrogens and androgens. The hormone aldosterone, again, which is a mineralocorticoid, which is responsible for sodium and calcium balance. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. Next is cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, responds to a variety of stressors, including exercise. And this is to ensure that glucose and free fatty acids, which are our fuels, are available. And also, amino acids are available for tissue repair. So, I know we covered a lot in this video, but let's quickly summarize with what we covered. One, we covered the different types of glands in the endocrine system. Next, we discussed the different hormones each gland is responsible for. And finally, we discussed the effects of each of these hormones. And so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care.